Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story.
How did a simple fence for my dog lead to be legally taking control of the neighborhood's favorite walking path? My HOA president started a war over my fence, hitting me with fines and false violations. She thought she was winning until a property survey revealed a shocking truth that let me take it all back.
My wife and I bought our house about 8 years ago in what seemed like a perfect neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and a homeowners association that appeared reasonable enough. The HOA fees were modest and the rules seemed standard, nothing too invasive. For the first 6 years, I barely even thought about the HOA. They maintained the common areas, organized a few neighborhood events, and generally stayed out of everyone's way. It was exactly what you'd hope for. Then, about 2 years ago, everything changed. The old HOA board, which had been made up of retirees who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, stepped down. A new board was elected, led by a woman I'll call Karen, because of course that was actually her name. Karen had moved into the neighborhood maybe 3 years prior and immediately positioned herself as someone who wanted to improve property values and maintain standards. She ran on a platform of stricter enforcement of HOA rules and won by a narrow margin, mostly because voter turnout was pathetically low. Only about 30% of homeowners even bothered to vote. The change was immediate and unpleasant. Within the first month of the new board taking over, violation notices started appearing on doors throughout the neighborhood. Someone's mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another person's lawn had a bare patch that needed reseeding within 10 days. Someone else had their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. These were rules that had technically always existed but had never been enforced with any real vigor. Karen changed that. I managed to avoid any issues for the first year of her reign. I kept my lawn maintained, my house painted, and didn't do anything that would draw attention. My wife and I joked about the increasingly absurd violation notices we'd hear about from neighbors, but we figured as long as we kept our heads down, we'd be fine. Then came the issue with my dogs. Over the years, my dogs had occasionally wandered into the woods behind our property, but as they got older, one of them started doing it more frequently and would go farther. I'd have to go searching for him, and with his age, I worried about him getting lost or hurt. A fence seemed like the obvious solution. We'd been thinking about installing one for a while anyway, and this gave us the push we needed. I'm not someone who rushes into things, especially when it comes to home improvements in an HOA neighborhood. I pulled out our HOA guidelines and read through every single rule regarding fences. The rules were actually pretty straightforward. Fences couldn't exceed 6 feet in height, had to be wooden or vinyl in approved colors, black, white, brown, or gray, couldn't have barbed wire or be chain link, and required submission of plans to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. Approval was supposed to be granted or denied within 30 days of submission. I measured out where I wanted the fence, took photos, drew up a basic plan showing the dimensions and placement, and submitted everything to the HOA with a formal application. The fence I was proposing was a simple 4-foot wooden fence in a natural brown stain, running along the back of my property to keep the dogs from wandering into the woods. It met every single guideline listed in the HOA rules. 30 days passed. I heard nothing. I waited another week, then sent a follow-up email asking about the status of my application. I got a response from Karen herself saying that my application was under review and that I should be patient with the process. I waited another 2 weeks, then sent another email. This time, Karen responded that the board had concerns about the aesthetic impact of my fence and needed more time to evaluate. I pointed out politely that the fence met all the written guidelines and that the HOA rules stated approval should be granted or denied within 30 days. She responded with a vague statement about how the board had the right to deny applications even if they met the technical requirements if there were other concerns. This went back and forth for another month. I'd ask for specific concerns. She'd give vague answers about neighborhood aesthetics or setting precedents. At the 2-month mark, I submitted a revised application with different wood stain options and slightly different placement, thinking maybe that would help. Another month passed with no response. I submitted a third application, this time for a shorter 3-foot fence made of vinyl instead of wood. Still nothing. By this point, I was frustrated beyond belief. I'd spent months trying to work within the system, had submitted 3 different applications that all met the written guidelines, and had gotten nowhere. My dog had wandered off twice more during this time, and the second time it took me nearly an hour to find him. I'd had enough. I contacted a few contractors and got quotes for the fence. I went with a local guy who'd done good work for one of my neighbors. I pulled the necessary permits from the county, yes, permits, plural, because I wanted everything done completely by the book from a legal standpoint. The contractor started work on a Wednesday morning. The fence I ultimately went with was the one from my first application. 4 feet tall, wooden, natural brown stain, running along the back portion of my property. It was exactly what I'd proposed months earlier and met every single HOA guideline. On Thursday afternoon, I was inside working. I work remotely as a software engineer for a tech company. When I heard raised voices outside, I looked out the window and saw Karen's car pulled up in front of my house. She got out and came to my front door, knocking loudly. When I answered, she was already worked up and demanded to speak with the contractors. I told her they were working on my property with my permission and she needed to leave. She walked around to the side of my house where she could see into the backyard from the street and started shouting at the contractors from there, asking if they had permits and HOA approval. The contractors stopped what they were doing and looked at me, clearly uncomfortable. I walked over to Karen and very calmly explained that I had submitted multiple applications for this fence, all of which met the HOA guidelines, and that I was moving forward with the project. I showed her my permits from the county, which were all legitimate. She couldn't dispute that, so she started arguing about HOA approval. I told her I'd waited months for any kind of reasonable response and had followed every written rule in the HOA guidelines. After she left, the contractors asked if they should continue, and I assured them everything was legal and to keep going. They seemed nervous, but agreed to finish the job. The fence was completed by Friday afternoon. It looked great. Professional, clean, exactly what I'd wanted. My dogs were thrilled with their newly secured yard, and I felt a sense of relief that they couldn't wander off anymore. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It was a violation notice stating that I had installed a fence without proper approval and that I was being fined $500. The fine would increase by $250 every 30 days until the violation was corrected. Correcting the violation meant either getting retroactive approval or removing the fence entirely. I responded with a detailed letter outlining every step I'd taken, the 3 applications I'd submitted over a 4-month period, all of which met the written guidelines, the lack of any substantive response from the board, and the fact that the fence as installed met every single requirement in the HOA rules. I requested that they approve the fence retroactively and waive the fine. 2 weeks later, I received another letter increasing my fine to $1,000 and stating that my fence was still not approved. The letter said that I had violated HOA rules by proceeding without approval, and that the board had the discretion to deny any application regardless of whether it met the guidelines. That's when I decided to hire a lawyer. I'd tried to handle this reasonably and had gotten nowhere. I found a local attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His name was Richard, and during our first consultation, he reviewed all my documentation and basically told me I had a strong case, but that fighting the HOA would likely cost me more in legal fees than the fines themselves. He suggested one more option before we went the litigation route, getting a new professional survey done of my property. Why? I asked. I know where my property line is. Richard explained that many HOA disputes get complicated when property boundaries come into question. He said that if we could establish exactly where my property line was and show that the fence was entirely on my land with appropriate setbacks, it would strengthen our position. Like most people, I glanced at the survey during closing but didn't pay much attention to the exact measurements. I knew roughly where my property ended and just assumed the woods behind the house were either common area or belonged to someone else. I never had a reason to check the exact boundaries until this whole mess started. I agreed to have a new survey done. It cost me about $800, which seemed like a lot, but was worth it if it would help resolve this nightmare. The surveyor came out, spent about 4 hours measuring and marking boundaries, and said he'd have the official documents ready in a week. When I got the survey results, I sat in my kitchen reading through them twice because I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. Not only did my property extend into the woods, but it turned out the property line was actually about 40 feet behind where my fence was installed. 40 feet. My fence was nowhere near my property line. It was entirely on my own land with plenty of room to spare. But here's where it got really interesting. That walking path that ran through the woods behind several properties in our neighborhood, the one that the HOA maintained and that neighbors used regularly, cut directly through what the survey showed was my property. The path had been there since before we bought the house. I'd never thought anything of it because I assumed it was on common land or an easement. According to this survey, approximately 80 feet of that path was on my property, and there was no recorded easement giving the HOA or anyone else the right to use it. I called Richard immediately and sent him the survey documents. He was quiet for a moment after reviewing them, then said, "Well, this changes things significantly." We scheduled a meeting for the next day. Richard explained that based on the survey, I had several options. The HOA had been trespassing on my property for years by maintaining and allowing use of that walking path. I could demand they cease using it immediately, or I could use this as leverage to resolve the fence dispute and the fines. "Let's use it as leverage," I said. I didn't actually want to be the guy who shut down the neighborhood walking path. I'd used it myself over the years. But I absolutely wanted the HOA off my back about this fence. Richard drafted a letter to the HOA. It was professional but firm. The letter outlined the following points. The survey clearly showed my fence was entirely on my property with significant setback from the actual property line. The fence met all HOA guidelines regarding height, materials, and appearance. I had made good faith efforts to obtain approval through proper channels for over 4 months. And most importantly, the survey revealed that a portion of the HOA's walking path was on my property without any recorded easement. The letter proposed a resolution. The HOA would immediately withdraw all fines related to my fence, provide written approval for the fence as installed, and issue a formal apology for the harassment. In exchange, I would grant them an easement for the walking path for a one-time payment of $10,000 to cover my legal fees and aggravation, and they would agree to approve any future reasonable requests I made for property modifications. I could have asked for annual payments, but I wanted this done and over with. It was more than fair, considering I could have demanded they remove the path entirely and take them to court for years of trespassing. Richard sent the letter via certified mail. We waited. 4 days later, I got a phone call from a board member, not Karen, but another member named Tom, who I'd actually met a few times at neighborhood events and seemed like a reasonable person. He asked if we could meet to discuss the situation. I agreed, but told him my attorney would need to be present. We met at Richard's office the following Tuesday. Tom came with one other board member. Karen was notably absent. Tom was apologetic and clearly embarrassed by the whole situation. He said the board had reviewed the survey and consulted with their own attorney, who confirmed that yes, the walking path was on my property and no, there was no recorded easement. He said they wanted to resolve this amicably and asked if the terms in Richard's letter were negotiable. I looked at Richard, who gave me a slight nod. "The terms are fair," I said. "I'm not trying to extort anyone. I just want to be left alone to enjoy my property without harassment, and I want compensation for the time, money, and stress this has cost me." We went back and forth for about an hour. They tried to get the payment reduced to $5,000, but Richard and I held firm at $10,000. They wanted to add some conditions to future approvals, but we pushed back and said any approval would be subject to the same written guidelines that applied to everyone else. Nothing more, nothing less. Eventually, we reached an agreement that matched the terms of our original letter almost exactly. The HOA board voted on the agreement at their next meeting. It passed, though I later heard that Karen voted against it. Within 2 weeks, I had a written agreement granting the easement in exchange for payment, written approval for my fence, withdrawal of all fines, and a brief letter of apology from the board for the misunderstanding. The check for $10,000 arrived 3 days after I signed the easement paperwork. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. About 2 weeks after everything was finalized, I started getting new violation notices. Someone reported that I was running an illegal business from my home. When the inspector came, I explained I work remotely for a company as a regular employee, which is completely legal and doesn't constitute a home business. The inspector agreed and closed the complaint. Then someone reported that my trash cans were visible from the street, which they weren't. I kept them in my garage except on trash day. Then someone reported that I had a garden gnome in my front yard that violated decoration guidelines. I didn't have any garden gnomes. I'd never had any garden gnomes. It became obvious that someone was filing false complaints about my property. I suspected Karen, but couldn't prove it. I installed security cameras covering my front yard, backyard, and driveway. They were good cameras too, 1080p with night vision and motion detection. Within a week of installing the cameras, I caught something interesting. Karen's car parked on the street and she walked up my driveway with her phone out, clearly taking photos of my house and fence from the sidewalk and public areas. She was being careful not to actually enter my property, but it was obvious she was documenting everything she could see, probably looking for more violations to report. She didn't notice the cameras and spent about 10 minutes walking around the public areas near my property, photographing everything she could. I saved the footage, but didn't do anything with it yet. I wanted to see if the harassment would continue. It did. Over the next month, I received 3 more violation notices, all for things that were either completely false or absurdly petty. One claimed my house number wasn't clearly visible. It was. Another claimed I had weeds in my flower beds. I didn't. We'd just had a landscaper out. The third claimed my fence was now showing weather damage and deterioration despite being less than 6 months old and in perfect condition. I responded to each violation notice with photos showing that the claims were false and copies of the settlement agreement stating that any future issues would be handled according to standard written guidelines. Each time the violations were eventually withdrawn, but the pattern was clear. Someone was targeting me. I went back to Richard and showed him the violation notices and the camera footage of Karen photographing my property. He advised me to document everything but not to take any action yet unless the harassment escalated or they tried to fine me again despite the settlement agreement. Then I had an idea. I pulled out the survey documents and looked at them more carefully. The property line extended 40 feet past my fence. The walking path ran through my property. What if I made that situation more obvious? I called Richard and ran my idea past him. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're technically within your rights to do that, but it's going to piss off a lot of people. The settlement says I can make any reasonable property modifications as long as they meet HOA guidelines, right?" I asked. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "Then let's do it." I contacted my contractor again. I explained what I wanted, a second fence running along my actual property line as shown in the survey. This fence would be on the back and sides of my property where the survey showed I had more land than the original fence enclosed. The fence would be 6 feet tall, the maximum allowed under HOA guidelines, made of solid wooden privacy panels in a dark brown stain. It would be built exactly on my property line, which was completely legal, since setback requirements only applied to structures, not fences on boundary lines according to county regulations. Here's the thing. Building this fence along my actual property line would completely enclose the HOA's walking path within my fenced property. The path would be inaccessible unless people climbed my fence, which would be trespassing. The contractor thought I was crazy, but agreed to do the work. I submitted a formal application to the HOA for the fence, including the survey showing my property boundaries and detailed plans showing the fence would be on my property line and meet all height and material requirements. Per the settlement agreement, they had to approve any reasonable request that met guidelines. I waited 30 days. No response. Per the HOA rules, lack of response within 30 days constituted approval. I had that in writing from the settlement. I gave them another week to be generous, then told the contractor to proceed. The work started on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the new fence was complete. It looked impressive. 6 feet of solid privacy fencing enclosing a significantly larger portion of my property, including the entire section of the walking path that crossed my land. The phone calls started almost immediately. Neighbors calling to ask what was going on with the path. Why was it blocked? Was this a mistake? I politely explained to each person who called that I had discovered the path was on my property, that I had granted the HOA an easement for the path in a previous agreement, but that my property rights allowed me to fence my property line. If they had issues with path access, they needed to take it up with the HOA. By Thursday morning, I had a voicemail from Karen. She was furious. She demanded I call her back immediately to discuss the illegal fence I had installed. I didn't call back. Instead, I had Richard send her a letter. The letter was beautiful. It outlined that I had submitted an application for the fence 37 days prior, received no response, and proceeded according to HOA rules that stated lack of response constituted approval. It noted that the fence met all HOA guidelines and was entirely on my property. It reminded the board of our settlement agreement regarding future approvals. And it very politely pointed out that while I had granted an easement for the walking path, that easement didn't prevent me from fencing my property line, and if the HOA wanted to discuss modifications to allow access to the path through my fence, they were welcome to reach out through proper channels. I got a call from Tom 2 days later. He sounded exhausted. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to be left alone," I said. "I'm tired of the harassment. I'm tired of the false violation notices. I'm tired of feeling like I'm being targeted for standing up for myself." "This isn't coming from the whole board," Tom said. "You know that, right?" "I assumed as much," I said, "but the board is responsible for what goes out under the HOA's name." Tom sighed. "What would it take for you to add a gate in that fence so people can access the path?" "An apology from Karen," I said. "A real one, in writing, acknowledging that the violation notices over the past few months have been retaliatory and inappropriate, and an agreement that there will be no further harassment." "I'll see what I can do," Tom said. 2 weeks passed. I got a call from Tom asking if I could attend the next board meeting. I agreed and brought Richard with me. The meeting was in the community center clubhouse. About 15 people were there, the 5 board members and various homeowners who'd shown up for one reason or another. When we got to the agenda item about my fence, Tom asked me to explain the situation. I laid it out calmly and factually. The months of trying to get approval for my original fence, the harassment, the survey that showed the path was on my property, the settlement agreement, and the recent pattern of false violation notices. I showed the timeline of events and the camera footage of Karen photographing my property while presumably looking for violations. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but Tom shut her down. When I finished, Tom asked if I would install a gate in the fence if the board agreed to my terms. "Yes," I said. "A simple gate that allows path access. I'll even maintain it myself, but I need to know this harassment is over." One of the other board members, a woman named Lisa, spoke up. "I think we need to acknowledge that this situation has been handled poorly from the beginning. I wasn't on the board when the original fence application was submitted, but I've reviewed the file. 3 applications over 4 months with no substantive response? That's not acceptable. And the pattern of violation notices after the settlement is concerning." Karen finally spoke. "He's been difficult from the start. He installed a fence without approval. After waiting 4 months and submitting 3 applications that met all guidelines," Tom interrupted. "Let's be honest about what happened here." The board discussed it for another 20 minutes. Eventually, they took a vote on my proposal. Karen would issue a written apology, the board would agree to cease any retaliatory actions, and I would install a gate in the fence for path access. The vote was 4 in favor, 1 against. Karen voted no and stormed out of the meeting before it was even adjourned. I got the written apology 3 days later. It was brief and clearly written through gritted teeth, but it acknowledged that some enforcement actions may have been overzealous, and that future interactions would be conducted in a professional manner. I installed a simple gate in the fence that weekend. It took about 2 hours. The walking path was accessible again, and neighbors thanked me when they saw me outside. Karen resigned from the board 6 weeks later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the rest of the board had pressured her to step down after several other homeowners came forward with complaints about aggressive enforcement and harassment. Tom took over as president and has been much more reasonable. It's been about 8 months since all of this concluded. I haven't received a single violation notice since Karen left the board. My fence is still standing, both fences actually. The dogs are happy and secure. The walking path is accessible, and my property value is just fine, despite all of Karen's concerns about maintaining standards. The whole experience cost me probably close to $15,000 when you factor in the survey, the original fence, the second fence, the legal fees, and various other expenses. But I got $10,000 back from the HOA, and more importantly, I established very clear boundaries, literal and figurative, about what I would and wouldn't tolerate. Would I do it all again? Honestly, probably not. It was exhausting and stressful, and there were times when I wondered if I should just back down and remove the fence. But looking back, I'm glad I stood my ground. The HOA needed to learn that they couldn't just bully people into compliance, especially when those people were following the rules. My advice to anyone dealing with an HOA dispute: document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to spend money on a good lawyer and a proper survey. Those things ended up being what turned the entire situation around for me, and sometimes being technically correct is the best kind of correct, especially when you have the survey results to prove it. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I run a small fitness consultancy business and have done so for the past few years. Since setting up, I have largely relied on word of mouth for most of my business, so I typically do not have to deal with many difficult clients. But I recently had a run-in with a woman who genuinely made my blood boil. Let's call her Gigi for the sake of anonymity. Gigi sent me a DM a few weeks ago saying she was looking to lose weight and tighten up her physique for summer. She did not really fit my usual client demographic. Most of my clients are in their 30s or 40s. Gigi was younger, mid-20s, and had a decent follower count. She seemed to be some kind of local influencer. That piqued my interest. I thought maybe I could benefit from her connections and boost my business a bit. How wrong I was. The initial consultation over text was pretty standard. I asked her some details about her past exercise history, diet, and so on before getting to work on her meal and exercise plan. Then we moved on to payment. I had mentioned pretty early on that I typically charge $50 for my plans, but either she did not read that or decided to pretend she did not know. When I reminded her of the price, she said, and I quote, "I was wondering whether you'd be interested in getting yourself some exposure instead of payment." I hate to say it, but at the time I was seriously considering taking her up on the offer. However, after talking to some of my friends, I snapped out of it and resolved to be firm on the price instead. She accepted, although somewhat begrudgingly. Looking back now, I am kind of stunned that she genuinely expected me to give it to her for free, but I guess that is how the influencer economy works these days. The plan consisted of exercises and recipes mainly designed around helping her lose weight. Usually I advise most of my clients to maintain a light to moderate calorie deficit. Not only is this generally healthier and better for minimizing muscle loss, but it also tends to suck a lot less than dramatic calorie reductions, which makes it easier to maintain long term. I explained all of this to Gigi. She said she understood that progress would not be immediate, so I thought we were on the same page. A week later, I woke up at 5 in the morning to an Instagram call from Gigi. I did not even know you could call people on Instagram. Half awake, I picked up the phone. "You're a ducking scammer. You think this crap is some kind of joke?" I was still in a daze, so I weakly asked her what was going on. "I just weighed in after a week on your bullcrap plan. I'm up half a ducking pound." I asked her to slow down and breathe, which seemed to calm her down, although only temporarily. I explained that we had already been over this, and that weight loss is not always a linear process. Scale measurements can be affected by anything from water weight to clothing to the time of day. "You're just covering your ducking ass. Cut the bullcrap right now." Oh well, I tried. I guess you cannot talk sense to an unstable influencer at 5 in the morning. "I've got a swimwear collaboration I need to shoot this week, and you ducking lied to me. Your plan didn't ducking work." Influencer to English translation. I successfully got something for free, and now I need to rip into you for something I did not get for free. Bear in mind, this woman was by no means overweight. Her BMI was already comfortably in the healthy range. But I guess an influencer's work is never done. On the verge of tears, she continued, "Do you know how ducked I am? I followed your plan to the ducking letter, and look where it ducking got me." Based on her tone and the time of the morning she called, she had almost definitely been on the receiving end of 3 or 4 margaritas, comfortably, which definitely was not in the plan. But I did not feel like pointing out the obvious. An hour later, she messaged again, still unhinged but slightly more coherent. "Refund me immediately and post a public statement on your page admitting your plan doesn't work and that I was right to call you out. Do it by noon or I start tagging every local gym and every brand that has ever worked with you." I sat with that for a minute, then an idea came to mind. I refunded the $50 within the hour and posted the following, word for word as requested on my business page. Public statement as requested by Gigi. I refunded the client in full. My standard plan prioritizes sustainable, moderate deficits and long-term adherence rather than dramatic one-week scale drops. The client reported following the plan to the ducking letter and still gained 0.5 centimes in 7 days. Therefore, by the client's own stated metric and timeline, the plan did not produce the immediate results she required for her swimwear shoot. She was correct to call this out. For context, we both live in a small, tight-knit city where everyone knows each other, particularly in the business community. I wanted to make sure any potential brand collaborators knew who they were dealing with. I left it at that. No extra commentary, no screenshots, no mention of the 5 a.m. call, the margaritas, the original request for free work, or the fact that she was already in a healthy BMI range. By lunch, the post had been screenshotted and circulated in a few local fitness groups. People started asking the obvious questions under her posts. She tried to walk it back by saying, "He twisted my words." Then she deleted her original rant. Then she went quiet. The collaboration still happened. From the photos that went up, the half-pound gain was invisible. My page, meanwhile, picked up a small but steady stream of new inquiries from people who specifically said they wanted the boring, sustainable version. I never heard from Gigi again. It is just like the saying goes, exposure is a dish best served cold. The next one is an entitled People Story. I thought this would be funny to share. It is kinda long too because I am just wordy. I am a 21-year-old woman, and today I was at a pretty popular theme park in Tampa for a work team bonding trip. There were over 130 of us split into little groups. It started raining pretty hard. No big deal. We were leaving soon anyway, so my supervisor, who is in his 30s, two of my co-workers, both women around 20 and 18, and I went to the ice cream place near the entrance. The line took a good while, which was mildly annoying, but whatever. Then a second employee came out. This older troll-faced woman, probably in her 50s or 60s, ran up to the left counter from behind us while my supervisor was ordering and started lecturing the poor employee about something. Then she demanded to order. The employee agreed. Personally, I would have sent her packing, but to each their own. The employee told her to order at the right counter, which was where we were standing. So this woman proceeded to shove herself in front of me and my co-workers after my supervisor stepped back. Then she gave us this pitiful little smile like we were supposed to be understanding of her and started ordering her stuff. I was not having it. At that point, we were all soaked, cold, and tired from going on rides all day. So I turned to my co-workers and loud enough for her to hear, said something along the lines of, "Some people are just so entitled and think they're so special that they feel the need to cut in front of everyone else." I also said something about how some people apparently cannot be patient. She finished her order, turned to stare at us, and I ignored her. Then she walked over to the left counter. I started my order, then heard noises coming from the bridge troll. I looked over and saw her mocking me, saying blah 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 blah, while doing the little talking hand gesture people do. She walked away, and while I turned back to the employee, I said out loud again, "You're a ducking 60-year-old making fun of 20-year-olds. The employee started dying laughing, and that was the end of it. My supervisor asked what happened, so I told him. He said I should not do that because I was representing my job. For the record, I was not wearing any kind of uniform or anything that would indicate where we worked. But come on, this is basic human decency and respect. I have had it with people stepping over me, so I am not holding back anymore. I know it is not much to post over, but I finally had something to share, so here it is. Anyway, thank you for watching.